Well, thank you for the invite to speak to you today. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the insects that I expect to see in this year. We'll get started with wheat midge, and I'll talk about the forecast for wheat midge. Wheat midge, as you know, has one generation per year. It overwinters as the cocoons in the soil, and the larvae will get active again as the soil temperatures warm up in the spring. Usually it's about mid-June, and then they'll go through a short pupal stage and transform into the adult. And then the adult insects usually emerge, it's late June, early July, depending on temperatures and degree day accumulations. As you can see in the picture, it's a bright orange fly, very tiny, about 2 to 3 millimeters. And then the female wheat midge will lay eggs on the wheat head. Usually it's the outer glooms of the wheat kernel that they lay the eggs on, but they can lay them anywhere. And then the eggs will hatch in about 3 to 7 days, and then the larvae will feed on that developing kernel. The larval stage is what causes the damage to the wheat kernel. Again, it's orange colored and very tiny, 2 to 3 millimeters. They feed for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they require some moisture in the form of rain or heavy dew to drop back down to the soil, where they'll dig down into the soil 2 to 4 inches and overwinter as cocoons. So in the picture, you can see what the wheat midge damaged kernels look like in the lower half. You can see it's very shriveled, and there's actually some wheat midge larvae there in the middle kernel. And then the healthy kernels are very plump and full. Every year, wheat midge goes up and down, so we don't know if we'll have economic populations. But when we do, we can expect losses of about 3 million per year without IPM. But with IPM scouting and using thresholds, we can reduce those costs. And of course, wheat midge is going to affect the yield, because many of those kernels are light and they get blown out the back end of the combine. And also you get reduced quality of the grain. And research up in Canada has shown that wheat midge flies can vector Fusarium head blight as they move around from, laying eggs on the heads of the wheat plant. We conduct a wheat midge larval soil survey every year, thanks to support from the North Dakota Wheat Commission. And the extension agents collect the soil samples out in the field. This last year, we did 205 fields in 22 counties. So that's 10 cores per field. So that's 2,050 soil core samples. And we added McKenzie County this year, so that's new. We added it because the extension agent indicated some farmers that were complaining about wheat midge infestations in the county. So we get the soil samples sent into my lab, and then we look for the cocoons, and then we also dissect the cocoons to see how many are parasitized by the beneficial wasp. And the maps are posted on NDSU Extension Entomology website, and then we also do a news release. And here's just kind of a simplified process of what we do to extract the wheat midge larval cocoons. First, we wash the soil, and then we collect it in organic matter in sieves. And then we do a saline flotation to collect the wheat midge cocoons, and then we have to examine it under the microscope. Here's the map from 2 years ago. You can see we had a couple of high risk and moderate risk areas. Anything that is more than 500 midge larvae per square meter is considered, moderate to high risk. So it would require scouting, and if you're at threshold, an insecticide application. So in the map, that's the yellow squares, the orange circle, and the red triangle. But we had about 58% of the samples with no wheat midge cocoons. And this is the current map. As you can see, there's overall decrease in the number of wheat midge. There's still a couple sites that were at high risk, Divide right there on the Williams Divide County border and Montreal County. And then the moderate risk was also in Divide, McLean, and Wells. So we had quite a large range of wheat midge, and then 86% of the samples had no wheat midge. So there was a significant decline, and the question you probably have is, why did we see this? And the answer is the rainfall that we received in August. As you can see, a lot of the wheat midge areas in the northern tier of the state had below normal rainfall in the month of August. And that's a very critical period because that's when the wheat midge larvae is dropping down from the wheat head to the soil, and it requires that moisture in order to survive. A lot of times they'll stay in the heads instead of dropping down, and then they end up in the combine bins. But normally we have more moisture and they'll drop down to the soil. So that significantly affects the number of overwintering wheat midge cocoons. So we look back to 2011, and you can see that we had a fairly good relationship between the number of wheat midge and the amount of precipitation in August. So it seems to go up and down. So when that precipitation is low in August, it decreases the number of wheat midge that successfully overwinters. There's also a biological control agent out in the field. It's a natural biological control that helps keep the wheat midge in check. Macroglenis penetrans is the name of the tiny wasp. It's very tiny. If you sweep it up in the sweep net when you're out in the field, it's a beautiful metallic green purple iridescence on the wasp, and it's tinier than the wheat midge, only 1 to 2 millimeters long. And it attacks both the egg and larvae stage of wheat midge. And in the picture on the left side, you can see the yellow circle, and that's a wheat midge parasitoid that we dissected from one of the wheat midge larval cocoons. And here you can see some eggs on the outer shafts of glooms of the wheat kernels, and that's what this parasitoid is attacking, is those wheat midge eggs. We also mapped this, as I indicated earlier, and here's the map from 2 years ago. We had an average parasitism rate of 36%, but you can see some of those red triangles indicate 100% parasitism. So this wasp is very effective when wheat midge is common. And here's the current map. As you can see, it declined significantly, only 15% parasitism rate on average. And this is because wheat midge is declining. We also monitor for wheat midge using pheromone traps in the Integrated Pest Management Crop Survey Program. We use the green Delta trap, and we place the traps out in the field at wheat head height during heading to early flowering, and then just check the trap bottoms weekly. However, the research has indicated that these traps, you can't use them for economic or action thresholds, but they do indicate when the populations are high and where they're at, and the need to get out to scout the fields when the populations are high. And we entered this into PestWeb at Montana State University, and the red spots show 500 or more cumulative wheat midge present in that area. If it has some little hatching through the circle, there's a parasitoid that has been present. And we trapped 26 trap sites in 20 counties this last year. And you can see there was fairly high levels at some sites. So here's an example of what the trap bottom looks like when you have a lot of midge. All those little spots there are wheat midge on the trap bottom. And the circle is actually a parasitoid that was captured in the sticky trap bottom. So I had quite a few wheat midge that we captured, over 11,000, but it was actually lower, 9% lower than what we had in 2019. And the highest trap catches were in the north central and northwest. And the parasitic wasp was observed in 7 counties, or 27% of the trap sites. And it's important, these traps are good indicators of where wheat midge and the parasitic wasps are present, and the distribution in the state, and whether they're at high or low levels. So regular scouting for wheat midge is a must when you think you're at economic or high populations, and we do that at night, as you know, and usually we go out after 9 p.m. and warm temperatures above 60 degrees Fahrenheit and light wind speeds less than 5 miles per hour. That's optimal conditions for scouting, and wheat midge will be flying when we have these conditions. There's many insecticides registered for wheat midge. The 1B is organophosphates. Lorsban has been very popular for wheat midge control, chlorpyrifos. And the 3As are the pyrethroids. There's only a couple that have wheat midge on the label, Declare and Warrior 2 and generics. And then the bottom 2 are generics or premixes, Cobalt Advance and Besiege. And the economic threshold levels are listed there at the bottom, and they haven't changed. It's hard red spring wheat, 1 or more wheat midge for every 4 or 5 heads, and durum wheat, 1 or more wheat midge for every 7 or 8 wheat heads. And here's some insecticide efficacy data for wheat midge. And if the yellow or the blue bar is the untreated check, the orange is Warrior 1 EC at 3.2 fluid ounces per acre. The gray is Lorsban 4E at a pint per acre. And the gold or yellow is Cobalt Advance at 13 fluid ounces per acre. If we take a look at the number of larvae per head, you can see all the insecticide treatments had significantly lower number of larvae per head compared to the untreated check. And out of the insecticides, Lorsban had the lowest number of larvae. If we look at the percent kernel damage, you can see we also saw the same trend with all the insecticide treatments significantly lowering the damage on the kernel. And Lorsban again had the lowest percent kernels damage. For yield, we saw significantly higher yields in all of the insecticide treatments, and there is no difference between the insecticides. So there's also host plant resistance for controlling wheat midge. It's the SM1 gene. Once the larvae starts to feed, it kills it. And this is called antibiosis type of resistance. And Montana State has released the variety Egan, which is resistant to wheat midge and striped rust. And it also has high grain protein. And it's sold as a blend, so you'll get 90% of the seed being resistant variety Egan, and then 10% being a susceptible variety. And they do this to prevent the development of resistance in wheat midge to this single resistance gene. So we need to preserve, so it's sort of like a refuge like we use in corn, the BT corn, and it's to prevent the development of resistance in wheat midge to this single gene event. Up in Canada, they have a lot of different SM1 varieties that are available, and some of them, Warman and Leroy, have both wheat midge and scab resistance. Here's some data from Montana State University. Egan is at the bottom there, and then they use susceptible varieties, Reader and Hank. You could see there wasn't any, 0 wheat midge in the spikes in Egan compared to Reader and Hank with 46 and 102. The yield was the highest with Egan, 52 bushels per acre, and the susceptible varieties were much lower. Protein was the highest, 17.8. Test weight was 56, and falling numbers 326. So Egan, it looks like a pretty good variety if you can get your hands on some of the seeds. Now the forecast for this upcoming year doesn't look too good. Hopefully this will change with some spring rains and summer rains. But right now, the whole state of North Dakota is in a drought. So one insect that you have to be concerned with when we have drought is grasshoppers in wheat. The young grasshoppers are called nymphs. They look just like the adult. They're smaller and they have wing pads instead of wings, so they can't fly, they only crawl. And there's usually 5 to 6 instars that the nymph has to go through. It depends on the species of grasshoppers. If we take a look at the life cycle of grasshopper, there's 1 generation per year. It takes 40 to 60 days to go from egg to adult stage. Let's start in the winter. They overwinter as egg pods in the soil 2 to 4 inches deep. In the spring, when the air temperature warms up to about 60, we start to see hatching of grasshoppers, and the first instar is very tiny, and it's usually only about the size of a wheat kernel. Peak egg hatch is usually about mid-June. And then they'll go through the different instars or growth stages, and they have to molt to grow and get to the larger instars. And then once they get to the 5th instar, we'll start to see adults emerging, and that's usually late July. And then the grasshoppers will mate and the females will lay eggs into the soil. Each female can lay 8 to 25 pods, and each pod can have 20 to 120 eggs. So you can see how the population can explode when we have favorable environmental conditions for grasshoppers. 2 times that's important to scout. Early on, usually you want to wait till we get to the 3rd instars, because the 1st to the 3rd instar don't move hardly at all out of the field ditches. But the 3rd instar, they may start moving into field edges. And then again, we want to scout for the adults late July into the fall. Grasshoppers have chewing mouthparts, so they'll completely strip the leaves, causing defoliation. They also feed on the wheat heads or pods of soybean and dry beans and flax, and they're fairly well known for clipping, especially on flax. Flax is very susceptible. They'll clip the bolls right off. When we have high population and scarce foods, they can move. They group together and move in large numbers. However, we don't have any more migratory locusts in North America. They went extinct. The Rocky Mountain locusts went extinct in 1902, but they would eat just about anything they would come upon. In the old time picture there, you can see an apple tree that's completely defoliated and debarked. Now, grasshoppers need fairly warm temperatures to feed. They'll bask in the sun in the morning. They have to warm up their internal temperatures to 68 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit before they can start to feed. Here's some IPM data for North Dakota. You can see we had fairly high numbers in 2019. The high numbers would be indicated by the yellow square and the red triangle. And then if you take a look at 200 or year 2020, you will see we have more yellow squares and red triangles. So it's important to get out and scout for the nymphs and adults. Generally, we recommend going out once a week. You can either visually count the number of grasshoppers per square yard or use a sweep net. If you have higher population, you may want to scout 2 to 3 times a week. For the nymphs, we want to check the ditches and the field edges in the spring. For the adults, we need to get out and check ditches, field edges, and walk into the interior of the field as well. So the action threshold is the threatening rating, and it's based on the number of nymphs or adults per square yard. And we have different ratings or thresholds in the margin and then in the field. So for adults in the field, it would be 8 to 14 adults per square yard. Well, when you get that many grasshoppers moving around and it's hot out, they're moving every which way, they're very difficult to count. So I'd recommend using a 15-inch sweep net. 4 180-degree sweeps is equal to that 1 square yard. So, and I recommend taking more than 4 sweeps, do like 20 sweeps per field and then divide by 5 to get your number per square yard. So here's some of the wheat insecticides with grasshopper on the label. Dimlin at the top is an insect growth regulator. So you need to get that on early when they're in the nymph stage. And they affect the nymphs as they molt and grow into the different instars. And then we have the 1B, the organophosphates, and then the 3As, which is the pyrethroids, which is the largest class of different chemicals available, and then at the bottom is some premixes. Now with grasshopper, it's often moving into the field late and we're getting close to harvest. So please be aware of the pre-harvest interval of different chemicals. It can range anywhere from 7 to 50 days. So here's some insecticide data on percent defoliation. The blue bar is the pre-treatment, and the 7 and 14 is days after treatment. The 7 is orange, 14 is gray. So here's the untreated check. You can see we had fairly high percent defoliation, 20 to 30%. And then these are all the different pyrethroids that I tested. And we also included a adjuvant preference, but it didn't seem to change the percent defoliation or increase efficacy. It was comparable to the chemical without the preference. Here's some Dimlin information, the insect growth regulator. You can see it's a little bit higher, but still it's significantly lower from the untreated check. And here's Lorsban. Again, this one was a little bit higher than the pyrethroids, and Lorsban has a shorter residual, so that's to be expected with grasshoppers that move around a lot and you get them moving in and out of the field. You need longer residual insecticide like a pyrethroid. Weed stem sawfly is also something that we need to get concerned about when we get to hot, dry, droughty conditions. It can increase, although looking at the IPM crop survey data for the last 2 years, we can see it's common in the north central, northwest, and the southwest, but really it hasn't increased to high numbers. So, but they're out there. So if we have hot conditions, we should be aware of weed stem sawfly. And again, insecticides are not efficacious against weed stem sawfly. The adult is long-lived, and we can't control it because it's a wasp that's heavily sclerotized, so it's very difficult to kill. And then the larvae is protected inside the stem. So again, host plant resistance with the solid stem using MOT is the most effective technique and crop rotation. There is some new chemistry coming for wireworm control in cereals from BASF. It's a new mode of action, a group 30 insecticide, broflanilide. It's going to be called Terexa insecticide seed treatment. And it's supposed to be registered sometime this year, I thought, but I haven't seen it yet. But the advantage of this chemistry is that it actually will kill the wireworm larvae, whereas some of our neonicotinoid in seed treatments that we commonly use, like Cruiser, do not kill the wireworm larvae. They just cause a temporary morbidity, which will stop the wireworm from feeding, but then it gets sick, but then it will resume feeding eventually. So hopefully we'll get this registered before we plant this spring. There's many NDSU insect resources available on the NDSU extension publication site, so you can download these PDFs and read them for more information. And also on my extension entomology website, I have all the maps for wheat midge going all the way back to 1995. And then we have a couple of videos on wheat stem sawfly that you can watch, and also the link to Ndsu and the wheat midge degree day, which is very effective in telling you when to get out to scout. And also if you enter your planting date, it will tell you whether or not your crop is at risk to wheat midge. And also you probably heard about the EPA registration review of chlorpyrifos, Lorspan, and generics. This one's currently being reviewed, and it's a widely used pesticide on many of our field crops and controls many different insect pests. And we feel that this is an important alternative chemistry that is useful, and we still need it to help prevent the development of insecticide resistance out there in the field. Like we have soybean aphids that are resistant to the pyrethroid groups, so we need organophosphates and other modes of action to control it. In wheat, you can see the long list of the different insect pests that we have registered with for Lorspan. And comments are due if you're interested in writing. Comments are due March 7th. And you can see the website there for the EPA, and I listed the EPA docket number. So I encourage you, if you would like to keep Lorspan, that we get as many comments into the EPA. And that's all I have, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
We do have some questions for you. So the first one is regarding wheat midge. How far can the midge disperse? When they emerge in the spring, how far do they travel?
Okay, the wheat midge is a very weak flyer. They do not disperse very far, but the winds can blow them for a mile, maybe, or several miles, but they generally stay in the area that they overwintered. So they do not move very far at all. They're a very weak flyer. They're, as you could see, they kind of look fragile when you look at them. They're like a tiny mosquito, but they don't fly very far at all.
Thank you. The next one is about the Lorsban rate. Is 8 ounces effective? Many acres have been treated as such since the trial, showing synergism between Lorsban and a fungicide.
Yes, I actually did some of the work for that. And yes, it is effective, but the thing you need to remember about Lorsban is the residual is fairly short. So if you decrease the rate to half of what the regular rate is, you're not going to get as long as residual. So if wheat midge reinfests that field later, you'll have to respray. Whereas if you use the full rate, you'll get a longer residual, maybe 7 days, depending on temperature and rain. And with the half rate, it decreases that residual probably close to a half, so 3 to 4 days.
Thank you. The next question, in lieu of scouting fields, would there be some merit to scouting and spraying ditches if necessary to take out grasshoppers at the second instar when they're confined to a smaller area?
Yes, we do recommend, if we're going to have high populations early, the counties usually get involved in doing some ditch spraying when we're going to have a grasshopper outbreak. And yeah, usually that is done by the county. So it's kind of a decision that is made at the local level, whether or not they're going to treat for grasshoppers. So we will need to monitor early in the spring and make a decision. If they're at the action threshold, then we would want to make the recommendation to the county to see if they would like to do some ditch spraying. But yes, this is a good recommendation to follow because the adult grasshoppers are much more difficult to control. You need a higher rate of insecticide. They're very mobile. They'll move they can fly long distances and they'll move around. So they'll be in the wheat fields, and then when the wheat's harvested, then they'll go to canola, pulse crops, and other crops, flax, and cause damage there. And the adults are long-lived. They live all the way from, the end of July till we have a good hard frost in the fall.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more question and then that's it, unless somebody throws some more in the Q&A box. So the last one is about the armyworm outlook in the wheat crop for 2021.
Yes, that's a migratory insect, so it's very difficult to predict how many we're going to get and when we're going to get them. And I'm planning on putting out some traps for armyworm this year with the IPM scouts. So I'm hoping to have a network that will be a little more prepared and know when they get up to North Dakota. They come from the southern states and they move on the winds into North Dakota. So they usually go into southern Minnesota first. So sometimes I do have a little bit of a heads up. But yeah, they were a problem in wheat this last year, and they're hard to find because they're active more nighttime. So we don't see them when we're out there in the day unless you dig around in some of the soil looking for them, or any lodge areas where the wheat's lodged, or the ditches. They could be moving out of the ditches into the field. So I'm hoping that this trap network will provide a little bit more of alert system for everyone. So, and we'll have them throughout the state. I haven't decided how many we'll do, but we'll probably do about a dozen trap sites or so. But yes, it's very difficult. I can't really say what the forecast will be. They don't like dry, drought weather. armyworm likes moist weather. So if we don't have a lot of moisture, that won't be favorable for them.
All right, we did have one more pop in. So for Lore's ban, has the EPA considered allowing some crops to be allowed with a reduced label?
No, what's going on right now is they're looking at the safety of Lorsban, and in children, they found that Lorsban, because it's somewhat vaporous when it's sprayed, and if children come into contact with it, they can have some brain injury. So I think that's one of the lab studies that was done that had the kind of got the red flag with Lorsban. But so we'll see. It looks like they're just targeting a few crop and going to reduce the number of crops that have Lorsban. I know right now they're looking at primarily corn, sunflowers, dry beans, and pulse crops. And I don't know why they're looking at those. Well, sunflower and corn, Lorsban would probably have to be applied with the airplane. So I think they're worried about, drift, I don't know, drift. And so, but I don't really know, why they're selecting those crops. But wheat wasn't on the hit list, I guess.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions that we have. Thanks
Okay,
so
thank
much
you.
for joining us today.